It's amazing how far we've come in video games. What started off as just a handful of pixels on a black background is now a virtual phenomenon that at times can almost look real. It's no surprise that a lot of gaming franchises have stood the test of time, and they've changed with the times, progressing from simple pixels to a 3D extravaganza. And that's what we're going to look at in this video, a selection of games that took the leap from 2D to 3D. And yep, there's a ton of them that have done it, so as always, be sure to let me know in the comments below which games I should feature if and when I do a follow-up to this. It was a pretty good topic. Now, keep in mind here that I'm only going to be looking at the first 2D game and the first 3D game of every franchise, and many of them have gone on to far better things, but that's for another day. Now, how about I shut up? You press that subscribe button and we take a look at some games. First up is of course Super Mario Bros. For the NES. Now there's nothing I can say about this game that you don't already know, so I'll keep it fairly brief. It's a 2D side-scrolling platform game where you play as Mario, or Luigi if you're player 2 in a 2-player game. Princess Peach, or Toadstool as she was known back then, has been kidnapped by the evil King Koopa, and yep, that's what he was called back then, and taken to his castle. So you set out across a bunch of levels, stamping on local wildlife and dodging bottomless pits and fire hazards to get her back. Now, the thing with this game is that it still holds up incredibly well, and is a hell of a lot of fun to play even to this day. The levels are all relatively small, but they're packed with things to collect. Coins for extra lives, hidden 1-ups and power-ups that let you get bigger and take an extra hit, or you can even throw fireballs with the help of a magic flower. And there's also loads of hidden things all over the place as well. Secret blocks that reveal beanstalks that take you to bonus levels, warp pipes that do the same, and even ones that will let you skip to different worlds. There is a surprising amount to discover here. The graphics for the time are nice and clear, and by now I'm sure everyone knows the reason that Mario looks like he does is because of the limitations, and the mustache and dungarees were a way of giving him definition and not just being a blob of pixels, and it worked. The levels themselves are fairly varied. You have plenty of tricky platforming sections of course, but there's also underground cave levels where things are more cramped, swimming levels complete with their own enemies and physics, and then there's Bowser's castle levels which even turn into puzzle element kind of things. Granted, you will notice that the backgrounds are repeated quite a lot and the layout of the levels is all that really changes, but it works well enough, and each world does get progressively more tricky as you play, and this is definitely not an easy game. Like, yeah, but now I suppose there's plenty of people that can beat it through muscle memory alone, but if you're playing it for the first time, you would likely struggle a bit by the time you get to the third world. But it's just so much fun to play that it's a game that I can come back to time and time again, even if it's just for a few minutes. The controls are still fantastic and incredibly responsive, and it really is hard to find a fault with the game. I'm guessing you've all played this one, so I don't really need to say much more, but in case you haven't, I do highly recommend you do so any way you can. When the N64 was launched in 1996, Mario was there to greet everyone for his first time in proper 3D. And this is my original copy of the game that I'm playing on the N64 we got when it was first released. Good times. The story here is exactly the same, as Bowser kidnaps Peach for the 100th time. I think she kinda likes it, you know. So Mario goes back to the Mushroom Kingdom after getting a letter about her giving him some cake, and you've got to go get her back. This time round you have to explore a huge 3D world with Peach's castle acting as a hub. Within it there's paintings you can jump into, which are your levels. Each level has a bunch of power stars you need to collect by completing certain objectives within those levels. You need the stars to open even more doors inside the castle, and eventually you'll fight Bowser himself. Again, I'm sure most of you already know how this goes. But the move to 3D here is just done so well, and the amount Mario can still do is genuinely impressive. For starters, Mario has a ton of moves at his disposal. You can of course run and jump as normal, but you also have a triple jump you can do, with each one getting a little bit higher. You've got a punch kick combo, which is your main attack, as well as being able to jump on enemies' heads. You can also swim, fly, pick things up, wall jump and more. It really is impressive still, and the controls are actually very responsive, letting you do all this stuff with relative ease. It's also pretty intuitive as well. The levels themselves are a bit of a mixed bag for me. There is a huge variety, from the intro Bob-omb battlefield where you're exploring a large grassy land filled with bob-ombs, to the ghost house which is packed with secrets. You've got fire levels, ice levels, deserts, underground caverns. The variety is really good, but there are some levels that are all quite annoying. For me, there's Tick-Tock Clock, where you're inside a clock, which is quite annoying, along with Rainbow Ride and Wet Dry World, which all have some very tough platforming, and Wet Dry World in particular forces you to raise and lower water levels to get around, which is something that has never been fun in any game ever. But the majority of them are still good fun. The tasks you get are varied, from just exploring till you find a star, to beating a boss, collecting coins, solving a puzzle. There's plenty to do, and the levels themselves often change slightly depending on the star you're getting. You are given a hint at the start of each level about how you get that star, but a lot of them are incredibly hard to get. As well as that, the castle itself has a bunch of hidden stars to find, and there's 120 in total. Get them all and there's a surprise waiting for you. Quite a disappointing surprise, but hey, it's kind of fun. Overall though, the move to 3D here was excellent, and this is another game that still holds up really well today. It does show some signs of age, like with the camera which moves in increments, not letting you put it exactly where you want it, and some crappy levels, but overall there really isn't too much to complain about here. It's also the game where we got Mario's now iconic voice, so that's got to count for something. There's so much to do here that this is a game that you can easily spend weeks playing and finding more and more as you do, and I definitely recommend that you do this if you can. Of course, you can't talk about Mario and not mention Sonic. So here is Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis if that's how you choose to live your life. Yeah, I'm bringing that back, Toby. You are Sonic, a blue hedgehog full of 90s tood. Dr. Robotnik has come along and captured a load of your animal friends and shoved them all into robots. You're not having any of that, so you take your spiky ass off to the streets of Green Hill, etc. to go and kick his butt. The gameplay is of course quite simple. You pretty much just go from left to right as fast as you can until you reach the exit. Except in Sonic games, the levels are actually a hell of a lot larger than you'd expect, and you can often spend ages exploring them, collecting hidden power-ups and extra lives, but only if you take under 9 minutes. If you take longer than 9 minutes, you'll die. Here you want to collect rings. 100 will give you an extra life, but they also act as a sort of shield. If you have at least one ring, you can take a hit, at which point you'll drop your rings, then you've got a few seconds to grab some back, but if you take a hit when you've got no rings, then you'll lose a life. There are other ways to die though, like falling into pits or getting crushed. These are instant deaths no matter what. There's also power-ups like shields and even speed boosts that can make you run even faster. These are fun to use, but can make it easy to just run into enemies. Also, if you have 50 or more rings when you get to the exit of a stage, you go to a bonus level where you've got the chance to find a Chaos Emerald. I quite like these bonus levels, and they get pretty hard. If you want to get the game's proper ending, then you'll need to collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds. I've actually never managed to do this. One day maybe. As I'm sure a million other tossers of the internet have already pointed out, what's funny is that how people always talk about Sonic's speed. But when you actually play the game, it's often better to take it slowly so you can avoid the traps and enemies. Also, most of the levels actually force you to play quite slowly, having to wait for platforms or run uphill a lot, and most criminally, the infamous underwater levels, which are just horrible to play if you ask me. But that doesn't mean the game isn't fun. In fact, it is. It's very fun to play, still to this day. The graphics are excellent, and I really like the style of everything. The music is also really good here. The controls are also incredibly responsive, even underwater, and it is a cool game. I've never been the biggest fan of Sonic games, and in my opinion, there isn't a Sonic game that is better than the Mario game of the same era, but the original Mega Drive ones are still good fun to play, even with some of the bullshit level design. You can still get these games on just about every platform out there as well, so there really is no excuse not to play them. Sonic didn't go 3D until 1998 when Sonic Adventure was released on the Sega Dreamcast to much excitement. In his adventure, Sonic has to stop Eggman, who is up to his usual tricks of capturing animals and trying to steal the Chaos Emeralds to get unlimited power. This time round, you have an open world hub situation where you explore a few environments and do certain tasks that open up the actual levels, or action stages as the game calls them. Most of the time your goal of these is just to get to the end of the stage, and you'll occasionally fight a boss. Some of these levels are very linear and basic and just have one path for you to follow, but others do offer more exploration. You also have a few other characters here that you can play as, including Tails, Knuckles, Amy, Big the Cat and the robot E102. The gameplay for each of these characters is slightly different, and they have a few stages of their own as well as sharing a few of the other levels, so they do have a few in common. Knuckles, for example, has stages where you have to go on treasure hunts and find crystals. When you're close to them, you'll get an indicator helping you dig them out of the ground or smash a box that contains them, or something along those lines. Amy has a giant hammer that she uses as a weapon, and most of her levels are more combat focused. Then there's Big the Cat, who's trying to find his friend Froggy, a frog. And to do that, you have to go fishing, and I still can't believe someone thought these were a good idea. The thing is, no matter who you're playing as, the game just doesn't really feel all that great to play, especially not for how it should do. The whole thing is just so twitchy and spastic and full to the ballsack with glitches. Oh, and by the way, I'm playing the updated Xbox 360 version here, which is supposed to be a better experience. Now, I will say that this is something of a guilty pleasure for me, but I wouldn't really say it's a very good game. Even though I know there's people out there that absolutely love this game, but those people are wrong. It's not a terrible game, it's just fine. First off though, the animation, which is just awkward at the best of times, is quite bad. No matter who you are, they just look really weird doing most things. Now, it does look kind of fine if you're just running in a straight line, but as soon as you try and move, everything just looks twitchy and the game freaks out. And this is perfectly translated over to the controls, which are just twitchy and awkward. There's levels where you're going really fast, and these can feel great for a few seconds, as long as you're just going straight. As soon as you have to turn a corner or even just move to the side a little, strange things will happen, like just coming to a dead stop, jerking awkwardly against the sides of levels, or most often than not, just falling through the floor completely for no reason at all and losing a life. It really just feels like the game isn't finished. Also, the cutscenes here are laughable, with some of the worst voice acting I've heard, terrible animation that often starts and finishes too early, and even times where the camera is positioned so the characters aren't even on screen. Considering this was Sega's big mascot at the time, it just looks very amateurish. Of course, on top of that, the camera kinda sucks. The Dreamcast only had one analog stick, so you use the L and R shoulder buttons to rotate the camera left and right, and you've got no control over zooming in or out, and at times it just refuses to move completely anyway. Most of my deaths came from falling off of things, or most often through things I wasn't meant to be able to, and that was mainly down to the camera most often than not. But yeah, I know I've shot on this game quite a lot, but I don't know if I'd necessarily it's a bad game. Well, maybe I would. It's one of those games that a lot of people have nostalgia for, but when you go back to it and play it nowadays, you really see how many glitches and gameplay problems it has. And when you compare it to even a number of PS1 and N64 games, other than the graphics, which are actually pretty damn good, the gameplay just doesn't even really match up to them. Mario 64 is still a much better game than this, deal with it. But I was always compelled to come back to it, and have actually nearly 100%ed the game, so it must be doing something right? But yeah, I'm sure people will tell me I'm wrong, and that's fine. Castlevania for the NES is one of the most popular games on the system, and it's easy to see why. You play as Simon Belmont, who is out to kill Dracula because he's a bastard and has all sorts of monsters that are being a nuisance. You have to make your way through Dracula's castle, fighting off hundreds of undead monstrosities from zombies, ghouls and disembodied heads, all the while avoiding the many traps that are all over the place, including crumbling floors, platforms that open up below you when you stand on them, and of course countless bottomless pits. It is a famously difficult game, even with regular enemies having movement and attack patterns that you'll need to learn before you're able to beat a level, and each level does get progressively harder and harder, with new enemies being introduced as well as some pretty damn tough bosses. You fight back with your awesome whip, which is always fun to use. It starts off small and weak, but you can get power-ups that drop from either enemies or by smashing the hundreds of candles all over the place that will make it more powerful and have a longer reach. You can also get sub-weapons like knives, axes, a watch that freezes time and more. These are really useful and can be used by holding up on the D-pad and pressing the attack button. Each sub-weapon has its strengths and weaknesses, and if you have the right ones against certain bosses, you can often make light work of a few of them. You need to collect hearts to use them, and for some reason these are your ammo, but by now we're all used to that in Castlevania games. You can get your health back by smashing blocks within the castle, which will then reveal wall meat. These meats are rare and often hard to find. You'll want to whip everything on your first few playthroughs until you learn where they're located. If you do die, you do go back to a checkpoint, which tend to be indicated by a door that you go through. This is kind of fair, and you also get unlimited continues. But if you do continue, you always start at the beginning of the stage and not the checkpoint. Though I did find this was pretty fair, and I did get a little further every time. And it's just so much fun to do that you don't really mind anyway. The graphics here are great, and I love the variety in enemies and locations. Seeing new enemies is always fun, and learning the best way to deal with them. This is another game where you're often better off not trying to kill everything, instead looking for patterns and seeing where you can just run past, especially against those damn Medusa heads. Controlling Simon is good as well. It can feel a bit stiff, though this is clearly deliberate. The controls are very responsive though. Once you jump, you're stuck in that trajectory and you can't correct yourself like you can in other games like Mario or Sonic. Also, be careful on knockback. It's one of those games where if you take damage, you're thrown backwards, which can lead to some really annoying deaths down some bottomless pits. It is probably the game's biggest killer. I do hate that, but it is all part of the experience with these early Castlevania games. Overall, this is still a really fun game, and another NES one that stands the test of time. It is well worth playing. Castlevania's first foray into 3D is also just called Castlevania, and was released for the Nintendo 64. They didn't even call it Castlevania 64, which is kind of impressive. In terms of story, yep, it's exactly the same, but it's actually set before the events of the NES game, but still, Drac is back and needs a good smack. This time round, you choose from one of two characters. There's Reinhardt and Carrie. Reinhardt plays like the classic Belmont with the signature whip at his disposal for killing monster bastards. Then there's Carrie. She is smaller and faster and uses projectile magic to attack, which is actually pretty cool and useful, and you can even charge your attack for a powerful homing bullet. Now, in terms of gameplay, I do have to say that the game actually does a decent job of capturing the feel of the original games, with you starting outside the castle and fighting an onslaught of undead nasties. As it's a 3D game, there's a lot more exploration involved as well. You've got to find items, keys and switches to open up gates and progress into the castle to get to Drac. Now, I will confess that I am only showing the first level here because I'm playing the actual game on my actual N64, and I have no idea where I've put my memory card, and you really need one to play this game, as the levels are large and tough, filled with deadly enemies and loads of traps and instant deaths, but there's no checkpoints, so if you die, then you have to start the whole level again, which can sometimes be hours worth of gameplay. If you have got your memory card though, there's crystals all over the place that let you save your game, and these are actually placed quite nicely and in places that mean you won't do a ton of backtracking. Annoyingly, I even have a save file on my memory card when I'm about halfway through the game. Ah well. But anyway, back to the game. The levels are large and the puzzles aren't anything crazy, mainly just finding items and switches, but as you progress you'll meet a few other characters who will give you little tasks to do, which is nice, and there's even a shop where you can buy healing items, maps and more. You still get your secondary weapons here, and they're all the same as the ones from the original game. These are very handy and pretty powerful. Something that is a little annoying though is that you have to press the right C button to pick anything up. You can't just walk over it, and there's a slow animation of you bending over to get it, so if you're being attacked but need to get an item that's right in front of you, you'll probably take damage. Thankfully, all healing items are stored in your inventory, and you can pause the game to use them at any time. I actually prefer this as it means they never go to waste. The game also has a day and night cycle, with certain characters and enemies only appearing at certain times of the day. There's cards that you can use to change it from day to night and vice versa, or you can just hang around for it to happen. But be careful, as depending on how many in-game days you take to beat the game, you get a different ending. Now, I have to say that I actually quite like this game, and I think it really does capture the feel of Castlevania well, but it does have some pretty big problems which cause a lot of frustration. Firstly, there's the camera, which is just terrible to be blunt. You have a couple of options for it, but you never really directly control it. It just does what it wants, and of course it's normally in the wrong place. What's worse is that the camera makes it hard to figure out depth perception of where items and platforms are, so there's loads of times when I'd fall to my death because I thought I was jumping on a platform that was actually closer to the screen than it looked. It kinda sucks. Also, there's times when you're fighting an enemy, but you're both so far away from the camera that it's hard to see what the hell's going on. I can't believe they left it like that. The second big problem is the platforming controls. It's all very floaty, with some pretty questionable collision detection, and it's very easy to accidentally fall off of ledges too fast and fall past the ones you need to land on, or just straight down to your death, especially on the first level. This is a complete control issue and very rarely down to the fault of the player. I really did find that most of the deaths I had were either camera or control issues, which is a real shame. However, the game is still playable, and more often than not, quite enjoyable. The graphics are okay, but not exactly the best on the system. There's some pretty sharp angles everywhere and jaggedy edges, but I like the designs, and as mentioned, the feel and atmosphere is very close to the originals. Overall, I think this is a game that gets a lot worse rap than it deserves. It's not the best game out there, no, but it's a solid 3D outing, and especially as it's the first try, and there's definitely some fun to be had here. Sticking with the horror theme, here is Splatterhouse. This is the arcade version. Splatterhouse is a cool horror game where you play as Rick, a weedy punk whose girlfriend gets kidnapped, because that's all girlfriends are good for, you know. Thankfully, Rick finds the Terror Mask, which transforms him into a huge hulking brute that can easily punch monsters into pieces in no time. The whole thing is played from a 2D side-scrolling perspective, and you've got to make your way from left to right fighting enemies. You can punch and kick when jumping or crouching, and these are pretty devastating attacks, reducing most enemies to mush pretty quickly. But you can also pick up weapons on the levels, ranging from meat cleavers to bits of wood, and in later games even guns. These all have limited use, but are very powerful, killing most enemies in just one hit, and usually with some really satisfying blood and gut splatters. And that's one of the big draws of this game. The gore here is excellent, and there's a lot of it. Enemies will melt and explode all over the place. It's great. There aren't many levels here, but they're all quite long and very difficult. This is definitely a coin muncher of a game. Enemies are always coming at you from every angle, and even though your attacks are strong, it's not always easy to hit enemies or dodge their attacks, partly because of their tricky patterns, but mostly because Rick is a cumbersome lump of shit to control. Now, I don't think the controls are actually bad here, he just feels like a sack of potatoes, moving very slowly and often sliding around more than you'd like. Some of the enemies here are very small, which doesn't help, and your attacks will miss them quite a lot, but it's perfectly playable and beatable. The graphics here are great, and I love the design of everything. The monsters and bosses look grim and are often references to other horror movies or media, which I always appreciate. This is definitely a game that I would recommend for fans of the horror genre. It's had a few console releases, and it can be frustratingly difficult, but it's always fun to come back to every now and then. Fast forward to 2010 and Splatterhouse got itself a 3D reimagining, also just called Splatterhouse, for the Xbox 360 and PS3. This is the Xbox 360 version. As with the other games we've looked at, the story here hasn't changed. You are Rick, a dweeb with a super hot girlfriend, and you go to an old mansion where she is promptly kidnapped by an evil mad scientist. Soon after this, you find the Terror Mask and put it on, transforming you into the Beast Blokey and letting you do some ripping and tearing. This is a pure 3D brawler, seeing you explore some quite large environments where your main objectives is to basically rip apart any enemy stupid enough to get in your way. You go from room to room in mansions, sewers, carnivals, graveyards and other stereotypical spooky themed places that are packed with gross looking monsters, and you beat them to mush. Rick's mask now has more tood of its own, because of course it does, and Rick and the mask have a constant bit of banter between the two of them, and the mask effectively acts as your radio buddy, telling you what to do and where to go, and of course insulting you when you're being killed. I have to say, I actually find the mask to be really annoying, and not the cool edgy thing it's clearly meant to be. Game developers love making games M-rated or for 18-year-old or more, but then making the characters have the personalities and humour of 12-year-olds. I really don't get it. You've got a few attack buttons here with a strong attack, weak attack, grab and dash. Of course, you can also unlock a bunch of combos by gaining XP from defeating enemies. In fact, there's actually a ton of moves here that you can get, and a lot of them are good fun to use, though I have to say that the combat himself really could have done with a bit of refinement. The hit detection isn't great, and blocking is a pain in the ass, and you really need to get used to blocking, as the enemies here are bloody hard. They take a ton of hits to kill, and will quickly gang up on you. You really do have to learn the combat here. As you can probably tell from the footage, I'm coming back to play this after about 5 years, and my skills are not what they used to be. What I do really like though is that as you damage enemies they get a coloured outline. When it turns red, just grab them and you can do a finishing move where you can rip them apart in some really gruesome ways. I never get bored of doing this. The graphics here are really cool too. A lot of the enemies are back with a new look and the animation here is excellent. There's blood all over the place and even more when you power up and transform into Super Rick, ripping enemies apart in no time. It's all very smooth and I never saw any slowdown or screen tearing. It's a shame that the controls aren't up to the same standards as the look and presentation of the game, which is really impressive at times. There's even 2.5D sections that can really call back to the originals, which is a really nice touch. Also, as you play, you can collect pieces of photographs of your girlfriend, which eventually make whole photos in your gallery. And yes, you get to see her boobies in this game. Quite a lot actually. I'm normally more than fine with that, but it really feels out of place here, and just completely unnecessary. But hey, it's still boobies. Overall, I think this is a good game, with some annoying gameplay issues, but I still had a real fun time playing it. It's got stupidly long loading times, and especially every time you die, which is annoying as hell, but I do think the gameplay is fun enough to check it out. Though I bought the game for about £4 a few years ago, and for some reason it's now gone up to between £25 and £50 depending on which version you get. I've got no idea why, stupid collectors. Oh, and just to put the icing on the cake, you can also unlock Splatterhouse 1, 2 and 3 on this disc and play through them in their entirety, which is always a great touch and came in very handy while I was recording footage for this game. Definitely one to check out, I'd say. Now it's time for the scariest game of all, Bubsy in Claws Encounters of the Third Kind. This is the Super Nintendo version, but no matter which one you play, you're going to have a bad time. Bubsy is a platform game where you play as an annoying bobcat who has to traverse some large levels collecting balls of yarn, or spaghetti if you're an idiot, while taking down the evil Woolies, an alien race who are up to no good. They're called Woolies, wool, yarn. Anyway, the gameplay is pretty simple, and it's your standard platform game stuff. You go from left to right, collecting anything you find and jumping on the heads of enemies to defeat them. The problem is that the game just doesn't control very well at all. It moves incredibly fast and Bubsy has stupid amount of momentum and you can only take one hit before you die, and it's one of the most tedious games I've ever played for the system. On top of that, you can't jump on all enemies, only some of them, and also some of the scenery will even kill you, so touching a manhole cover means that you lose a life. There's a hell of a lot of trial and error to know what is deadly and what's just a regular flower or something. Because the world is so deadly, you have to move pretty slowly through the levels, making Bubsy's speed totally useless and actually a hindrance. You can also glide, which does come in handy in skipping large portions of levels. However, you are open to touching the evil scenery or enemies by doing this, and you also have no idea of where you're going to land, usually resulting in you landing in a bottomless pit. There are boss fights if you have the patience to get to them, and these are all equally annoying thanks to poor hit detection and one-hit deaths. It's a real shame, because the game looks great with some excellent graphics and animation, there's loads of cool scrolling, and there's even some hints at a good idea here, and this really could have been a fun game if they just playtested it properly. Surely someone must have realised this was annoying to play. I really struggle to find nice things about this game, and other than having some nice visuals, I'll always tell people to avoid playing this at all costs. It's rubbish, and so is its sequel, also released for the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. You can imagine my excitement when Bubsy 3D was released for the PS1 in 1996, the same year as Mario 64. Bubsy is 3D in Forbidden Planet, to give it its full title, is a 3D platform game where Bubsy is kidnapped by the evil Woolies and taken to their home planet in space. Sadly, rather than discovering he can't survive in their atmosphere and dying a painful death, Bubsy instead escapes and has to find parts of a rocket so he can fly home. You do this by exploring some very ugly 3D worlds, collecting atoms and hunting down the rocket bits that are hidden on the levels. As you can imagine, it's not done well. To start with, the game just looks atrocious. I'm not entirely sure what the hell most of this is meant to be. Levels are an ugly mess of single coloured polygons with barely any textures or detail to any of them. Bubsy himself doesn't look too terrible, to be honest, but the enemies are just a mess of polygons that often don't make sense, even up close, and they've got barely any animation. Everything just looks so unfinished. And then there's the controls, and man are they bad, but like really bad. There's no analog control here, it's all done with tank controls, but Bubsy has the turning circle of a U-boat, so if you do want to turn, most of the time, you've got to stop in one place, rotate, and then just move forward again. It makes basically doing anything a real chore. Collecting items is a mission in itself, and because of this, coupled with some bad collision detection, it means that you usually just walk past items, or sometimes even just go through them. This also applies to actual platforms. It's very easy to fall off them, and of course lining yourself up with them in the first place isn't easy. You do have a strafe button, which can help, but you have to be standing still to strafe, so you can't circle around things. The look of the levels also makes it really hard to know what the hell you're doing and where the hell you are. You've got no control of the camera, and everything just looks the same with the strange patterns everywhere, and I'd often have no idea where I was or where I needed to go. Thankfully, here you can take more than one hit before you die, which is good, as jumping on enemies to kill them seems to be a lottery of whether you take damage or they do. It's so inconsistent. And don't get me started on the bosses. I got to the first two of the bosses and I fought them both and had a miserable time, and I'm still not entirely sure what I did to beat either of them. I do know that I died a hell of a lot though. Oh, and just to make things more annoying, you can't touch water at all. Like, even if your little toe touches it, it's an instant death. Except later on there's swimming levels where you're just swimming in the water. Make your mind up. And of course, because of the move to CD based games, they were able to give Bubsy a ton of voice samples, and it seems like they went out of their way to make him as annoying and obnoxious as possible. He has the most annoying voice of any video game character I can think of, and on top of that, nothing he says is clever or funny. It really is like they wanted to make a really bad game. And if that was the case, then mission accomplished. I genuinely hate this game, and I think it's the worst game I've played on the PS1, and definitely one of the worst I've ever played, and that's for real. This is a rare case of a game actually being as bad as people says it is. So yeah, make sure you give it a go.
Player 2, fight!
Why does it always risk of rain on me? Is it because I play it constantly? Why does it always risk of rain on me? Even when the wisps are smiling, they can't avoid my lightning. Hello, my name is Beltbuckle Bill, and this is Risk of Rain 2D to 3D. Risk of Rain is dubbed as a roguelike platformer. It grabbed me by the short and curlies when my pal Rupee introduced me to it. Created by university students on a super low budget, it blew gamers away with its simple graphics yet immense gameplay. Initially, you can only play as one character, unlocking others with feats as you go along. The storyline is simple. You're in a container, you crash on a planet, and you have to kill monsters to escape that planet. Each character has unique abilities, no two are the same. Sure, you get a range of melee and ranged attacks, but they vary from bullets, arrows that home in, bouncing grenades, swords, chef knives, and many, many more, with 12 characters to unlock, some easy, others a little more tricky to unlock. There are a handful of levels that randomly generate each time, with the exception of the final level and boss, which are always the same. There are dozens of enemies, including sub-bosses, that'll have you running for the hills at times as you try to find somewhere to hold them off or wait for your special to recharge. There is honestly so much to this game, I don't feel I can do it justice. Dozens of items and special weapons, a large majority that stack to make you the ultimate killing machine. And I haven't even mentioned the drones you can recruit, or the fact that you can play it 4-player on the same screen, or across a network. The retro graphics are super pixeled, but so detailed and clearly very well thought out, with hundreds of hours programmed for the smallest details. The controls are very responsive, with each button on my PlayStation controller having a different action. Some jumping sections are very tight though, so make sure you go for the hoopoo feather or hopoo feather or hoopoo feather for double jumping action. I love this game so much, replaying it to unlock all the characters and achievements and the madness that can ensue when you are armed to the teeth and enemies die without you having to click a single button. and then they took it up a level. Risk of Rain 2 followed 6 years later, and it was clear the budget had changed significantly. Everything was 3D now. The majority of characters and enemies were still there, but with some new additions to boot. When they first released the game, it had no end boss. You either died or obliterated yourself. They said they created it this way for replayability, and while it did have it, it just didn't feel the same to play it without a natural end. During this release, I think I got up to level 40 and enemies would die milliseconds after spawning. Check out my YouTube for evidence. Beltbuckle Bill 33. And whilst the madness was enjoyable, there was no happy ending, and you stopped playing when you got bored. Luckily, they came to their senses and released a final level and boss in later updates. Like the original, you can choose not to go to the last level and instead repeat all other levels, but it feels right for the game to end rather than when you tire of it. Like the original, it is multiplayer, albeit not couch co-op, which is a shame, as my son and I love playing the original together. Unlocking characters, items, weapons and alternative character actions is one of the biggest replayability draws. I've played an unthinkable amount of time on this game, and if I put it on now, I'd still have a blast. It's got a steep learning curve, but once you get there, it's an absolute joy, and you know full well I'll be buying the shameless cash grab upgrade of the original, back in 2D, Risk of Rain Returns, set to release this month. Thank you for listening. Back to Player 1.
Here is Wave Race for the original Game Boy. It's a simple racing game where you pilot a jet ski and race against a bunch of other racers over a number of tracks and cups, where of course you want to end up being the one with the most points at the end. It's a pretty basic racer. You don't have much in the way of options here. You've got one choice of vehicle and 3 cups, each of which do have a few courses. It's all played from a top-down view, and it really reminds me of the Micro Machines games, even though it's nothing to do with them. The courses are pretty varied in terms of layout, though not really look. There's lots of tight bends that are tricky to get through, as well as obstacles to avoid, jumps to use, and even currents that are going the wrong way that will slow you down or push you off course if you don't dodge them. These are indicated on the tracks by little arrows showing the way that the current's moving. There are checkpoints here as well, though these are basically impossible to miss as you have to go past them by following the course anyway. Each race only has 4 people in it, but that's enough. There's always one that's really hard to beat, one that's slightly easier, and one that's basically useless, and then there's me. Actually controlling your craft here actually isn't very good or easy. You use the control pad to rotate left and right, but it's very slow, and cornering is really tough. Also, avoiding things at short notice is almost impossible, and you'll need to learn a lot of the later tracks if you want to stand a chance of winning. You do have a boost, which is constantly charging, that you can use with the B button, and this can help on the straights, but not so much on the corners. I did also find that at times when I did run into an obstacle, I'd get stuck to it, and it was hard to get off it thanks to the sticky controls. As well as the race mode, you've got a slalom mode, where you can make it through some more trickily placed flags. I didn't really enjoy this mode at all, as the maps were quite confusing, and it was really hard to know where the hell you needed to go. I'm sure with a bit of practice I could do better, but it didn't really make me want to try, to be honest. I was actually surprised when I played this, as I thought it was going to be quite a lot of fun, but I actually found that I didn't really have much fun with it at all. This is not one that I'd recommend playing. Fast forward 4 years to 1996 and we got Wave Race 64 for the TurboGrafx CD, and boy, what an upgrade. This sticks to the same race formula, but being in 3D, it's made everything a whole lot better. You have your championships where you can now choose from a few different characters, each with their own stats for handling, speed and so on, and what's actually quite nice is that you can customise their stats to what suits you, so you're not actually stuck with the stats for certain characters and you can mix it up a bit. There's a few cups here to race in, each of course with their own tracks. The tracks are nice and varied and they all look great. Amazingly, the water effects here are still pretty damn impressive for a game that's nearly 20 years old. You really have to use the waves to your advantage and know how to bounce off them and when just to ride straight over them. The courses are all pretty challenging and will definitely need to be learned before you win consistently, not only thanks to the layout and hazard, but also because there's floating checkpoints all over them, which you have to either pass on the left or right. Passing the checkpoint correctly gives you a notch on your power meter, which gives you a better top speed. If you miss a checkpoint, you'll lose all your power, slowing you right down and mean you've got to build it up again. And to make it harder, you can only miss 5 checkpoints before you're disqualified. This is a lot easier to do than you'd think, and it really gives the game a good challenge, but I would say it's a fair challenge. The controls here are excellent. The N64's analog stick, yeah, I mean you didn't actually think I meant this came out on the TurboGrafx CD, did you? Anyway, it lets you do some really tight cornering, and with a bit of practice you can twist and turn all over the place. There's also jumps on the levels, and you can do tricks off of these if you're so inclined. This doesn't do anything in the races other than look cool, but I'd avoid it as it is really easy to mess up and make you fall off and lose a position. There is, however, a dedicated stunt mode where you have all new courses full of places for you to do sweet barrel rolls and 360s. Being on the N64, you can also play this game with up to 4 players for some really fun races. They are especially fun if you like jerky slowdown. Gotta love the N64. Really though, that's all there is for me to say about it. It's a racing game, so you know what you're gonna get. But it's pretty damn impressive for a launch title on the N64, and it is actually still really fun to play. It's a series that I am kind of surprised has died out. I'd love to see a new one on the Switch or something. This game is well worth checking out, as well as its even harder but fun GameCube sequel. Here is Duke Nukem, which was released exclusively for DOS. Duke Nukem is a 2D action game where you are, of course, Duke, the all-American one-man army who sets out to stop the evil Dr. Photon, who's doing the usual evil Doctor things of unleashing robot menaces into the world, and on top of that, he taunts Duke, and we can't have that. So Duke has to set out across 3 different episodes, one set on Earth, one in space, and also in the future, to stop him. The gameplay is simple. You guide Duke through some surprisingly large levels that are packed with bad guys. You shoot the bad guys in the face until they explode, all the while collecting a load of items for points, health, or extra power. There's also keys dotted around the place. These are your main focus, as every level has a number of locked doors that you'll need to open to get to the exit of the stage. These can be very hard to find thanks to the size of the levels and the lack of any sort of map. However, most levels shouldn't take more than 10 minutes or so to beat, so the game is actually pretty still fun to play and doesn't get too tedious. Duke has a laser gun that you can use to blast enemies with, and it gets upgraded a few times as you go on, provided you find the power-ups in the levels. These let you fire more shots in one go and have more power, of course. You also get boots that make you jump higher, letting you do a sweet flip. I like this a lot. The levels are all fairly samey, and they're basically just mazes for you to find all the keys and kill enemies, but the fact that they're pretty short and that you can save your progress means that it was a game that I was kind of hooked on, and I've actually played through it 4 or 5 times. I like how it looks, with some pretty cool sprite work, though it does move quite jerkily, which is a bit annoying at times, especially when it comes to dodging enemies. But to be fair, that's how a lot of games were back in the day, before smooth scrolling became common. It reminds me of the awesome Dangerous Dave games, and if you're familiar with those, it means we can be friends. What I don't like though are these sounds. It uses the PC speaker for the sounds, and as such, it's just a series of horrible ear-piercing bleeps and bloops that make me want to scream. And because they're coming from your PC speakers, your options are to have them on or off. There's no volume control. But it doesn't take away from the game, and it's still fun to play through. You can probably beat this in a couple of hours if you wanted to, and I actually would recommend doing so. There is a fantastic Apogee compilation available on Steam that has all the DOS Duke Nukem games in it, along with a ton of other awesome games that I highly recommend. I think I paid about £2 for the whole collection, and it's totally worth that. And finally for today, in 1996, we got Duke Nukem 3D, which was absolutely revolutionary at the time. This is the 3rd game in the Duke Nukem series, which gives the 3 in the 3D a double meaning, which is always fun. The story here is that an evil alien force has come to Earth and has been stealing Earth's babes, so they can be used to give birth to more aliens. Pretty gross. But man, this game was, and forever will be, awesome. It's now a first-person shooter full of massive guns, tense battles, and of course babes. Much like the original, you have 3 episodes here, one set on Earth, where you have to explore the streets and buildings of towns until you find the alien ship that is hiding somewhere. Then you have to go into that spaceship and you fight the aliens in space in the 2nd episode. And the 3rd episode sees you back on Earth, finishing off the aliens down here and taking down their leader once and for all. Now what's cool is that there are still new versions of this game coming out on modern platforms today, and they include a bunch more levels and episodes, so chances are if you buy this game now you'll see plenty more on offer. Anyway, what made the game so revolutionary was, well, just about everything at the time. The levels are all large open environments that are packed to the brim with enemies, weapons and a ton of secrets to find. What's also impressive is that the levels are very interactive, letting you blow holes in certain walls to find new areas or create shortcuts in the levels. There's even buttons, TVs, sinks, toilets and even lights that you can use which do various things, which doesn't sound that impressive, but there were no other games at the time that offered this sort of interactivity and, in a way, realism that we got here. There's even a pool table that you can find that lets you have a game of actual pool. Well, kind of. There's a ton of enemies here, from standard soldier aliens to pig cops, robot suicide ships, big fat flying men and some huge minigun wielding monsters. They all look really cool and are fun to fight thanks to the awesome array of weapons at your disposal. You start with a pistol, but you soon get your hands on a shotgun, rocket launcher, machine gun, pipe bomb, shrink rays and more. All the weapons here have their uses too, and will even find yourself go back to the pistol every now and then. And if that runs out, you can just kick enemies in the face if you want to. Ammo can be scarce in the upper difficulties, and the game is pretty tricky no matter how tough you make it, thanks to the enemies packing a punch, and also a little bit of bullshit thanks to the classic hit scanning enemies at the time, meaning that if you're in their line of sight, there's basically nothing you can do to avoid being shot. Duke can find a number of items to help though, like a jetpack that lets you fly, portable medikits that you can use whenever you like, holograms that distract the enemies, and night vision goggles letting you see enemies in the dark. There's just a ton of stuff here to make every level even more fun. Though, having said that, some of the levels are pretty annoying. The game is still very much a case of find keys to unlock the doors and move on, but some of them are hidden so well you can spend literal hours running around lost only to find you missed a tiny hidden area or something. But for the most part they are good fun, and they look pretty great, packed with pop culture references from the time. I could really gush about how much I love this game for hours. It is easily in my top 10 FPS games. Hey, there's an idea for a future video. And I really think it's a game that everyone should own. There's just so much to do here, including the crazy map packs like the ones you're seeing on the screen at the moment that makes everything kind of summery. Much like Doom, I have this game on just about every system it's been released on, and it's one that I never get bored of playing. I'd say of all the games we've seen, this one probably has the biggest jump in terms of progressing from 2D to 3D, and it's just a shame that it's now a bit of a dead franchise. The series has a fantastic sense of humour, and it's one that would probably not be allowed to be made today, and John St. John as the voice of Duke is really iconic in the role. If you don't have this game, you need to change that and grab a copy as soon as you can. It's available just about everywhere and more than worth it. So there you go, a bunch of games that made the transition from 2D to 3D. What are some of your favourites? I had a blast checking out these games, so we'll definitely look to do a part 2 in the future, so I need some of your favourites to include. Thanks to Beltbuckle Bill for getting involved with this video as well. And don't forget, if you want to be involved in any of my future videos, just drop me a message on here or on my Instagram page. Now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.